Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday. So, just a couple of announcements off the top. I think last week we decided that we would do an assignment in lieu of the final quiz. And so we will do that. I'll have something for you tomorrow for us to read and discuss and do some writing on. Okay, so that assignment will come tomorrow, and should have enough time to finish it tomorrow, but I'll make it due on Friday just in case you need a little extra time. So that we'll do that tomorrow. Also, the things that we talked about yesterday with regard to the presentation, I put into Microsoft Teams. So there's a little post. There's a little post there in the main channel. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. But it's just a text summary of some of the things that I explained yesterday. Okay. Okay. That said, let's jump into where we were, right? So we said that once Boris Yeltsin had managed to take his Russian Republic and escape the Soviet Union, he still had a huge number of problems in front of him, right? He still had to kind of create a democratic system and also kind of rescue the economy, which was in a pretty sorry state, right? The economy had kind of ground to a halt under the Soviet Union, but now without the Soviet system and without kind of a socialist economy, Vladimir Putin, Boris Yeltsin starts to transform the communist system to a market economy, right? And he said his approach, kind of rightly or wrongly, is what they call shock therapy. And so basically he tried to change everything really quickly in the hope that, it would be really ugly and really painful for a very short period of time, but then they would be okay, right? And so it's kind of like a Band-Aid. When you have a Band-Aid on, it hurts less if you just rip it off really quick, right? And so that was his plan, to sort of do it really fast and hopefully it wouldn't hurt. But it did hurt, right? And so this process of kind of increasing interest rates and reducing credit, removing any market subsidies and price controls and things like that, all had the effect that people suddenly their money wasn't worth what it used to be. Lots of people lost their jobs, prices went through the roof, and the whole thing became very, very difficult for Russians. And it's a difficult decade for the Russian people, especially when they probably thought that when they left the Soviet Union, things would get better, right? Communism was gone, a market economy was here, and that their quality of life was going to increase, right? But again, what we see is that it actually decreases for the first little bit. As a bit of a spoiler, things are much better in Russia now than they were in the 90s, of course. But again, the Russians thought they were going to enter this market economy and sort of period of their lives where their quality of life was better, but instead kind of the opposite happens for the short term. And so as Boris Yeltsin continues on through the 1990s, he continues his market economy reforms. In the process, he manages to create a group of oligarchs, right? A group of people who become super, super wealthy because they're able to get assets that used to belong to the state, and they've managed to maneuver themselves into owning them. And so we've got about 12 guys who own big telecommunications companies, big oil and gas companies, big mining companies, and chemical manufacturing. And so these guys are wildly, wildly wealthy, right? And they become wealthy in the process of everyone else becoming poor, sort of thing. So the Boris Yeltsin's market reforms don't really work very well, but for a few people they work really, really well because they're able to get their hands on all of this stuff. So by the time we get to the end of the 1990s, we said that Boris Yeltsin is kind of tired. There's lots of opposition to his presidency, that some people are talking about impeachment. He has a drinking problem, which is limiting his ability to fulfill his presidential duties. There's charges of corruption and around people around him, and so it's really time for him to step down, right? And he does, right? He goes on television just like Mikhail Gorbachev did 8 years before, and resigns, right? And I won't read this again, but you can see that it's kind of sad, right? Because he had the idea that he was going to be able to take the Russian Federation into a bright, modern future, right? And it didn't quite happen, right? He wasn't quite able to do it. And so, I believe him here for whatever sort of character flaws the guy might have. I believe that he really wanted to make a better life for Russian citizens, and he didn't quite succeed. But he also had a near impossible task of converting one economy to another, which is one that most people don't do, right? Although we did, when we were talking about China, we did see Deng Xiaoping do that very thing, right? We saw that he took a socialist, a communist economy and started to convert it to a market economy, right? But we saw that Deng kind of did things in sections, right? He started with one city and one region, and then sort of converted it in a sequential way, right? Which I think was a little less disruptive to Chinese citizens. But here, Boris Yeltsin goes for the all or nothing approach, and it's pretty devastating to a lot of people. So he steps down, we said, and in his place steps in this guy, right? Vladimir Putin. Basically a political unknown at the time, right? And we watched the documentary on him yesterday, and we said that he was a former KGB agent, right? And so he's part of the Soviet Union's secret police. He's a spy in East Germany until East Germany reunites with West Germany, and then he has no job. He comes back to Russia and manages to get a job as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, right? Because his former professor is the mayor, right? And in the process, we saw that it seems that Vladimir Putin was kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Embezzling and misappropriating funds is what they call it, right? And so he was in charge of granting business licenses and buying food and approving construction projects. And he seems to have done those things, but sometimes he did them with people who were not reputable, right? And so he used St. Petersburg's money to buy a bunch of food from a company that was owned by a friend of his, right? And then the friend didn't deliver the food. Vladimir Putin didn't say anything about it, and they probably split the money, right? And so Vladimir Putin was able to steal some money from St. Petersburg, right? And I think the same thing happened over and over again with food and construction projects. He probably took bribes, right? Both from reputable companies, but also probably from the Russian mafia. And so he was able to enrich himself because he had money, right? He had the power to spend St. Petersburg's money, but he also had access, right? People needed his permission and authorization to do things, and I think he sold that permission for a price, right? Or at least that's what people are accusing him of in the documentary. We saw in the documentary as well that he's kind of picked by Boris Yeltsin because when the mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, when he's accused of corruption, Vladimir Putin stays loyal to Anatoly, right, and helps him escape the country and escape corruption charges. And so when the same thing is happening to Boris Yeltsin, when people are accusing him of corruption, Boris Yeltsin needs someone who will succeed him, right, who will replace him as president. But then once they do, he needs someone who's not going to try to file criminal charges against him. And Vladimir Putin has proved that he won't do that, right, that he's loyal to the boss. And so they choose Vladimir Putin, and indeed he does not he doesn't go after Boris Yeltsin afterwards. But of course, Vladimir Putin needs to be elected after that, right? Because he's just appointed in a temporary fashion by Yeltsin, but he needs to be elected as president of Russia. And again, nobody knows who this guy is, right? He's a nobody at the moment. But then what happens? Then what happens? Nobody knows? Well, we saw yesterday in the documentary that a number of apartment buildings are bombed in Moscow and in other cities, right? And so these are just regular apartment buildings with regular people living in them, blown up, right? And so the Russian government says that it is Chechen separatists, right? An ethnic group that lives in Russia that doesn't really want to be part of the Russian Federation. And so Vladimir Putin blames the Chechens, launches a war against them, and kind of appears as the tough guy, right? The guy who's going to avenge Russia, right? The guy who's going to catch these terrorists, right? And of course, his approval rating goes way, way up, right? Because he's positioned himself as a hero, right? The guy who is going to catch these horrible people. But then, and I'll show you this again today, just so we can be sure of what we're hearing, then evidence came out later that members of the FSB, which is currently the state police in Russia, they were involved in planting explosives below another apartment building that didn't get blown up. And actually when someone saw them loading the explosives into the basement and called the other police, right? And so it seems that the Russian government was maybe involved in blowing up these buildings. And if so, that means that Vladimir Putin blew up those buildings of his own people just as a political move, right? So that he could be the hero and, appear like he was, getting tough and going to, catch these terrorists. But again, if that accusation is true, there are no terrorists. He's the guy who ordered it. Okay. From there, let's continue. So just give me a second here. I just want to see where we should start from, because I want you to see that part of the documentary here. Oh, sorry, that's really loud.
The Soviet Union.
Nope, that's not right. Okay. Give me one second here. I'm just going to figure out where we should start from. Wow, that's loud. Back it up. Okay. Gonna start here. We're gonna start at, if you're online, we're gonna start at 1745, okay? And we're gonna watch, let's see. We're gonna watch 25 minutes, okay? So what is that, 25, 35, so watch to 42 minutes, 45 seconds. Okay, that's what we'll do. So online people, will see you very shortly, okay?
And who was responsible have never been adequately answered. Mikhail Trepashkin was hired by one family to try. He's a former KGB officer himself and a lawyer who had his own doubts about the official story, doubts that only grew when he saw the reaction of his former security service colleagues.
Мне заявляли вначале, что не копай.
They were telling me, don't dig into it, otherwise you will get imprisoned yourself. And then specifically they were telling me in a straightforward way, just leave it if you don't want to have trouble. And I was saying that, well, I'm the former investigator and I have experience and I can help. I can run my own investigation.
But there would be many obstacles put in his way.
The Russian government destroyed all the evidence in the case of the earlier bombings. No sooner had the bombings taken place than bulldozers showed up to remove the rubble, including human remains. And in that case, they destroyed the crime scene.
But then something else would happen, far away from Moscow, that would cast even more doubt on the government's explanation of what happened here. In another apartment building in another town, residents noticed strangers putting sacks into a basement there. The residents called the police called the bomb squad, which quickly discovered that the sacks marked sugar, in fact contained the same explosive that had been found in the Moscow bombs. It was a military-grade explosive called hexagon. The detonator was one commonly used by Russia's military as well. But what really cemented the scandal, the strangers who'd placed the bomb. Under questioning, they admitted they were secret agents of the FSB.
I think that the evidence that there was an FSB operation to place explosives in the apartment building in Ryazan is incontrovertible.
To murder your own citizens as they sleep in their beds for political reasons, how do you wrap your head around that?
On a personal level, I think it is an example of evil. I personally have concluded that it was one of the worst things I can think of.
The suspicion that the Kremlin itself was responsible for killing so many has been raised in several documentaries and books and investigations. But Putin has called the charge utterly insane. In trials that were widely questioned, a number of people were convicted of the bombings, none of them Chechens or members of the FSB. Since then, it's proven dangerous to ask questions.
People who tried to investigate the apartment bombings, in many cases, ended up dead.
The list is long. Sergei Yushchenkov, a Russian politician who headed an investigative committee, gunned down outside his home. Anna Politkovskaya, a well-known journalist and Putin critic, also killed in her apartment's elevator. And Alexander Litvinenko, a former SFB officer who publicly accused Putin of ordering the bombs, died in London poisoned with polonium. Each of the murder investigations remains clouded in suspicion. Sergei Markov is a longtime Russian analyst authorized to speak on President Putin's behalf.
There have been a number of credible investigations that have concluded that this was the work of the FSB and could not have happened without the knowledge of Mr. Putin.
It was no one credible investigation which shows that it had been done by FSB. All this propagandistic quasi-investigation, just using tricks and so on. I already heard about this story, about this FSB exploded the building in the Moscow maybe hundreds of times. And all of these people free, nobody was in jail. Don't become a victim of propaganda. It's very dangerous also.
Mikhail Tropashkin knows that. He became a victim too. 1 week before he was to report his findings to a parliamentary investigation, he found himself pulled over at a highway roadblock.
So they stopped me at a police checkpoint where there was a crowd of people. They checked my identification twice and checked the car, and they didn't find anything. And when I was closing it, one of the officers threw in a bag, and I told him, "That's not mine. Why are you putting that in my car?" He opened the bag and said, "Here is the gun. Here is the gun." And I was immediately arrested.
Trepashkin was sent to prison for 2 years. After his release, he continued to speak out about his investigation and was jailed for 2 more years.
Well, the apartment bombings, they cost thousands of innocent lives, both Russian and Chechen, by starting a new war. They brought to power someone from the security services, and that's Putin, who, of course, had no interest in democracy.
The first thing Putin did after becoming president was grant Boris Yeltsin immunity from prosecution. But his administration quickly moved to ensure Putin's safety too. Case number 144128, that corruption investigation in St. Petersburg, quietly went away.
The Prosecutor General gave an order that the criminal case should be terminated. It was explained to us that criminal investigations are not pursued in relation to the president.
Investigator Zhikov can only wonder how history might have been different if he'd been allowed to arrest Russia's president.
People would respect civil law, because everyone would understand that if the president can be prosecuted, then in essence our officials would understand that the law has to be protected. As it now stands, Russia has no law.
When we come back, Putin woos the West.
On Blueberry Hill, when I found you, I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill.
Of all Vladimir Putin's strategies for maintaining power, charm is not to be underestimated. He seduced Russians with carefully crafted imagery, the West with promises that he was a man they could do business with. George Bush famously came to that conclusion after simply looking into his eyes.
Putin was trained in the KGB to deceive foreigners. He has a very sharp eye for human weakness. He's good at persuading people and at intimidating them. And he's been doing this with Western leaders, sometimes with charm, sometimes with threats. But boy, does he do it.
If Western leaders hoped that Putin would steer Russia towards their ideals of democracy, liberalism, and capitalism, a meeting in 2003 would underscore just how wrong they were. It was an extraordinary gathering in the Kremlin's historic St. Catherine's Hall. In attendance, the nation's oligarchs, those who'd become billionaires under Boris Yeltsin, and who had their own hopes for Putin as well. The richest of them all, the man with the glasses on the left, Mikhail Khodorkovsky.
I got the impression that he was a person of our generation.
What do you mean by that, of our generation?
Our parents' generation, they have a totalitarian view. Even if they're against it, as opposed to our generation, we're closer to the West.
But by the early 2000s, the West was cracking down on corruption. New legislation had just been passed in the United States. If Russians wanted access to financial markets, they'd have to start playing by new rules.
By 2003, corruption was already the key method of state governance used by the bureaucrats, and bureaucrats started to demand the kind of money that was impossible to hide. One had to make a choice, build companies that are open and list them, or do business Russian style. In other words, pay bribes, receive privileges, but remain within a closed system. We decided the question was worth discussing.
In the meeting, Khodorkovsky asked to speak frankly.
Масштабы коррупции в России, оцениваемые экспертами 4 организаций, приблизительно одинаковые. В районе 30 миллиардов оценивается долларов.
As I understand it, what you were essentially doing with the television cameras running was accusing the president of Russia of running a corrupt state.
На самом деле я его лично в коррумпированности
Did not accuse him personally of corruption, and this is not how he took it.
и не воспринял эту историю.
Yes, I did accuse his inner circle and him of creating a model that uses corruption as its backbone. And he told me that we too took part in creating that model.
Мы принимали участие в создании этой модели.
Мы с вами обсуждали в свое время, да?
At that point, Putin turned the tables, reminding Khodorkovsky that his oil company, Yukos, was facing troubles.
Надо отдать должное руководству компании ЮКОС. Так? Она договорилась с налоговой службой, приняла все претензии и закрыла все проблемы, закрывает все проблемы с государством. Но как-то эти проблемы возникли. Может быть, именно
It was a veiled threat, delivered with a cold smile.
Я не считал, что мы были настолько влиятельны, чтобы...
Did I realize it would provoke Putin's displeasure? Of course it did. But I thought he would choose the European model, and I was not the only one thinking that, because it was obviously more beneficial for the country.
Очевидно, более выгодно для страны.
But Putin also perceived Khodorkovsky as a political threat. He'd been funding opposition parties and spending money promoting democracy. The meeting in the Kremlin sealed his fate. 8 months later, he was arrested, his oil company dismantled and divided among Putin loyalists. Russia's richest man would serve 10 years in a Siberian prison camp. Today, he lives in exile in Switzerland and has no doubts about Putin's legacy.
Сначала он хотел... Он считал, что он сможет...
At first, he thought he could build a sort of a democratic model that he could control. A model like this does not exist, so he started to slide towards, at first, mild totalitarianism and then an increasingly harsh totalitarianism. If the situation develops further, he will reach a full totalitarian model. In reality, every authoritarian system is a kleptocracy.
Является клептократической.
The roots of that kleptocracy have been exposed in a number of investigations through Europe. In Germany, a money laundering probe uncovered documents linking Putin to the Tambovskaya mafia group in St. Petersburg. In Spain, diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks quoted a Spanish investigator calling Russia a virtual mafia state and questioning whether Putin was implicated and whether he controlled the Russian mafia's actions.
If you put these people in the United States or in Canada and check what they've done, they're criminals.
Valeri Morozov is a Russian construction magnate who did a lot of work for the Kremlin before going into exile in London. Corruption didn't start with Putin, he says, but under Putin, it was perfected.
He changed immediately the whole system, but not changed, he made it different. He made it in order. It is everywhere. It is a system.
Sergei Kolesnikov is another Russian tycoon who lives in exile. He fled to Tallinn, Estonia. He's known the system from the inside and claims the corruption goes all the way to the top.
Это основной принцип работы.
Russian business entirely depends on protection. You need protection. It is called having a roof, or in Russian, krysha.
Существует эта крыша, тем более у тебя будет.
And the more krysha you have, the more successful your business will be. So every businessman dreams about giving presents and gaining protection. And if you give a present to the president, it's like having God himself watching your back.
Это вообще предел мечтаний. Выше уже только Господь Бог.
Kolesnikov used to run one of Putin's gifting projects and explain to us how the scheme worked. A business puts money into a charity, in this case, Pole of Hope. Kolesnikov's company, called Petromed, then takes the money to buy medical equipment, purchased from Siemens. But the profit margin is huge, around 40%, and that money gets funneled through a myriad of other companies to end up in something called Rosinvest. Before he fled, Kolesnikov says he owned 2% of Rosinvest. Who owned 94%? Vladimir Putin.
Все инвестиции, которые и все проекты,
all investments, all projects of Rosinvest were only implemented if Putin said yes to it. So no activity would have been possible without his acknowledgement.
Был принят к реализации.
So where did the money go? According to Kolesnikov, it was diverted to build a palace. And not just any palace. This multi-$100 million extravaganza overlooking the Black Sea near Sochi.
Когда я начал в начале 2009 года,
I started saying that I'm not happy with all finances going for this palace. And I was told, Putin is the Tsar, and you are his serf.
Putin – царь, а ты холоп.
Kolesnikov believes his scheme was only one of many ways Putin made money, hidden in a labyrinth of shady structures often held by others. How much is a matter of speculation, but also some educated guesswork on the part of Moscow political analyst Stanislav Belkovsky.
I started such investigations more than 7 years ago. And in late 2007, I published my estimate on the assets being under Putin's personal control. It was the figure of $40 billion.
$40 billion, a figure that was later confirmed by the CIA, according to press reports, and that, if true, would make Russia's president one of the richest men in the world. But what happens when that man no longer sits atop of the system that made him so rich? A 2007 U.S. State Department cable, again made public by WikiLeaks, reported that as he neared the end of his second presidential term, Putin was worried. He understood, according to the cable, that there was no rule of law in Russia, no way to ensure the safety of his secret assets abroad held by proxies. To leave power would be dangerous, and Russia's president knew it.
There's never been a good succession model in the Soviet Union or in Russia, and he's very worried about how he will leave power. He doesn't want to leave in a coffin, he doesn't want to go to a jail cell, and he doesn't really have the mechanism to do it because he has got so many guilty secrets, so much money's been stolen, so many people have been killed, so many unspeakable abuses have happened that he doesn't really trust anyone to look after him, to keep him safe if he steps down from power. So in a way, he's both the master of the Kremlin but also a prisoner in it.
Putin kept his proximity to power by swapping places with his prime minister in 2008. 3 years later, he was pushed aside, and Putin announced he'd run for president again. That brought masses of angry Russians onto the streets. And for a time, Russia's strongman almost seemed vulnerable. But the demonstrations were quelled. and Vladimir Putin would go on to win his third election in a vote widely noted for its irregularities. When we come back, Putin on the offensive.
He has a very strong sense of entitlement that Russia had stuff taken away from it during the Soviet collapse, and Russia has the right to get it back.
By 2012, Vladimir Putin was Russia's president again, this time with an even longer mandate. Presidential terms had been extended to 6 years, which means Putin could remain in power till 2024. But the Russia he rules over is not the country he promised to build. In the cities, there is a veneer of prosperity born of high oil prices. But the economy has been pillaged, productivity little better than in Soviet times. And in the vast reaches where the majority of Russians live, conditions remain stubbornly medieval.
Putin's greatest fear is that the Russians will realize that his modernization project has failed. He came into power promising to make Russia into a modern Western country, and it's still basically a corrupt, backward country.
The bottom line, just to put it with two numbers is all we need. The median or the midpoint wealth for the average Russian is $871. According to Credit Suisse. Very neutral report. $871 means half the population has more than that in wealth and half the population has less. Median wealth in India, over $1,000. So the average Russian is poorer than the average Indian. So that's one number, 871. The other number is 110. 110 individuals own 35% of the wealth of Russia. They are the most unequal country, by far, in the world.
Now, to distract from that, a very powerful tool he's got is anti-Westernism. Blame the West for everything that's going wrong. Blame the West, indeed, for the isolation and stagnation of Russia. And couple that with a very powerful propaganda machine where all the mass media is under Kremlin control. And he's in a very good position. He has a very strong sense of entitlement that Russia had stuff taken away from it during the Soviet collapse, and Russia has the right to get it back.
Cue the nationalist card. In 2000, Putin waged war in Chechnya. In 2008, Georgia. In the last year, he has redrawn the map of Ukraine, annexing Crimea and supporting rebels in the former republic's eastern regions. It's all played well at home. On the streets where they demonstrated against him 2 years earlier, the invasion of Crimea had Russians singing Putin's praises. And the West, concerned about economic ties with Russia, unsure what to do.
And we see a series of escalating provocations against the West going back many years. And at every stage, we try and overlook it and keep on trying to bring Mr. Putin in. We invite him to our summit meetings. We try and treat Russia as a normal country. And we think we're trying to calm things down. But in fact, what we're doing is we're stoking things. We're giving Mr. Putin the impression that we're not to be taken seriously, and he can continue to push us harder and harder and harder. And that's extremely dangerous.
After Putin's adventures in Crimea, the United States called for strong sanctions against Russia. But in the capitals of Europe, there was reluctance. Until July, and an act of violence that would change everything. Malaysian Air Flight MH17 brought down over eastern Ukraine, almost certainly by separatists using a Russian-supplied weapon. 298 people were killed, and the West was finally galvanized to act.
I demand that Russia fully cooperate with the criminal investigation into the downing of MH17.
It's necessary to make it clear it will not be business as usual.
We're opposing Russia's aggression against Ukraine. which is a threat to the world, as we saw in the appalling shoot-down of MH17.
In November, at the G20 meeting in Australia, Putin was relegated to the margins of the class photo. Obama and European leaders who'd once welcomed him as one of their own now distanced themselves. At lunch, Russia's president seemed a lonely figure, and he left the summit early. But the country he headed back to was in even deeper crisis. Plummeting oil prices, a ruble in free fall, and new robust sanctions beginning to take their toll. The question now on many minds is, what does Vladimir Putin do next? To some, a story from his boyhood could yet prove telling. It happened in this building where he once shared a one-room apartment with his parents. And it involved a rat that Putin had cornered. Biographer Natalia Gavorkian.
He said that I learned very good. I learned forever. Don't try to push somebody into the corner. They will jump. Because when you don't have what to lose, you attack. I think it's absolutely true about himself. When he's in the corner, that's why he's dangerous. He can jump. He will not say, okay, let's talk. He will jump.
Say that again?
Maybe like it is most of the parties like same as Soviet Union, but like with some slightly different.
Yeah, kind of in a way, right? There's still, there's still a small group of people who are ruling and making decisions in Russia, right? And again, it's, they've been able to convert themselves to a market economy, which they are now. But there's some pretty surprising stats, right? The writer at the end, those two numbers, those are pretty surprising, right? What did they say the average in terms of wealth of the average Russian is $871? Is that what it was? Something like that? $871, whereas the average Indian has $1,000 or so. So interesting, right? We kind of imagine India to be kind of a poor country. Of course, there's wealthy people in India as well, but the Russians are not financially well off. Yet 110 Russians own. Yeah, and so we were just talking about this in social justice this morning, right? And so Russia wasn't on any of those graphs that we saw, but the inequality is wild, right? And part of it is because of, what happened in the 1990s, but the other part of it is that it's a very corrupt system, right? And people are, like they said, paying a lot of, providing a lot of gifts. It's a bribe, but gift sounds nicer, right? And then they receive privileges, right? They receive protection from people higher up who let them get away with things that are illegal, right? And so everybody kind of helps everyone out. You throw a little bit of money around and it gets the job done, right? And even, I haven't been to Russia since 2008, I think. 2008, I haven't been there. But it's still, the last time I was there, it was still kind of like that. If you want things to happen, you've got to, put a little bit of money down. And when you do, things happen, right? And so I swear to you, a little bit of money makes things happen. And if you don't put the money down, sometimes things take a long time, right? So it's an example. I was an archaeologist before, and what I needed was when we were digging and we got all these little samples, like animal bone samples and human bone samples, and I had to bring them back to Canada so they could be analyzed. And so I had to get you need a proper documentation to take them out of the country. So I had to go to the office and fill out a form and ask this woman to prepare, this government worker to prepare the documents for me. And I told the Russian guy I was working with, I said, I got to take it down to this woman. And he said, he's like, oh gosh, it's going to take like a month to get those documents. Like, you're never going to get them before you leave. And I was like, okay, well, that's not good, but I'm going to try. So on my way to the office, I stopped and I got a really nice box of chocolates. Like, I spent money. I got a really nice box of chocolates. And I went to the office and I said, here's my, form, and I need it prepared, and I'm leaving, and this is for you, And she's a very sweet woman, and she's like, oh, these are very nice, and anyway, the forms are supposed to take like a month or 6 weeks to get, and I got a phone call from her before I got back to my apartment that they were done. Like, I didn't even get, like, I got on the bus and I was going back to the apartment I rented, and I got a phone call saying they're done. And so I went right back and picked them up. So again, a little bit of grease goes a long way, right? And so, but I think that's still very common in Russia, right? Is that people, use that money to make things happen. And that's, I think that's a legacy of the Soviet system, right? In a system where everyone was supposed to be economically equal, the only way you can, you can't work harder and get more money. That doesn't work in a socialist system. So how do you get more money? Well, you sell your influence. right? You need me to do something for you. You need me to provide you with forms or documents or a permit. What's it worth, right? You give me a few extra rubles and maybe your application goes to the top, right? Maybe your form gets done first. I have a whole stack of forms. I could do them in any order. I could start here, I could start here. What do you think, right? And it's very, again, I think it's a legacy of Soviet times, but Putin has, failed to eradicate the corruption in Russia. And in part, I don't know that he really wants to, because he's part of it. He's doing things the same way, right? And so he doesn't really want to do those things, right? And so, it's an interesting country, and it's a country that it's kind of interesting that it's been, poised. It's been poised to have democracy and sort of a rule of law a couple of times, and then it's fallen back, right? They had the czars, and then the czar abdicated. There was a provisional government. This is back in 1917. Yeah, a provisional government that's trying to draft a constitution, and then in come Lenin's Bolsheviks, and they overthrow the provisional government, and they create a one-party state, right, in communism. And then when they finally get rid of the Soviet Union and Russia leaves the Soviet Union, we have Yeltsin, and Yeltsin's trying to, create a market economy and a democratic state, but then he steps down, and who steps in? Well, a guy who has no interest in democracy, right? And so, again, we have, from the outside, we have democratic things happening, right? We have a legislature that meets, and we have elections that go on, but it's all kind of controlled by Putin, right? And by people around him that are wealthy and powerful. And again, in the first part of the documentary, I wish I remembered names, the writer, the woman said, we should probably look at this not as a democracy that's failing, but as an authoritarian state that is succeeding, right? It's not that they're failing at being Democrats, it's that they don't want to, right? And the democratic stuff is really just for show. Yeah. And so, it's an interesting country, but again, it's one that, we should continue to pay attention to, because Vladimir Putin is constantly trying to legitimize his power, and part of that is why should he stay in power, right? One of the authors, or one of the analysts, said, his modernization project has failed, right? The idea was that Russia would, emerge as a modern, democratic market economy, that people's quality of life would increase. And, the fall of the Soviet Union was it 30 years ago now? Yeah, 30 years ago, the fall of the Soviet Union. Actually, the anniversary will be this year, right, in 2021. It's been 30 years, and the average Russian citizen is not really that much better off than they were under the Soviet system. A little bit, right? But not that much. And so what's Vladimir Putin really bringing to the table? Why should he be in power? And so constantly what he's doing now is, because he can't really seem to rescue his own country, he attacks other ones, right? He tries to undermine democracy so he can say, look, you don't want democracy, look what happens, right? And so what does he do? He cyber attacks the US during their elections, right? He'll do the same thing to Canada during our election in the fall. Probably not to the same degree as the US, but Russians will be trying to hack our election and spread misinformation, right? Because again, he likes to look at the Western world and say, they're all against Russia, right? They're all going to mistreat us, and their democracy, look, it's chaos, right? You think I'm doing a bad job? Maybe, but if you get rid of me, then what do you get? You get democracy, and here's what democracy looks like. It's a disaster, right? So he's simultaneously trying to, maintain control in his country while undermining other democracies, right? And again, we've seen Russia's been very active doing that in France, in the US, in the UK, in Canada, and other major democracies as well, right? And so again, you know, Donald Trump's admiration of Vladimir Putin is highly suspect, right? Because he's not the friend of the United States, unfortunately, right? And he's a spy, right? Like when you take all the other stuff away, he's a KGB spy who's will do whatever he has to. You can tell how much fondness I have for this guy. So let's see here. Any last comments about Russia or about Putin or about Soviet Union? Because I think we've kind of brought ourselves up right to the minute with the Russian story, right? All the way from early 1900s, Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, who's Andropov, Chernenko, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Putin. So it brings us all the way up to the minute. No? All good? Okay. So, like I mentioned, tomorrow we're going to do I have an assignment for you to do. I think it's going to be on Xi Jinping. When we left off the story of China, we kind of finished after Deng Xiaoping. There's a few leaders in between Deng and Xi, but we'll kind of skip over them in the interest of time, and we'll go right to where we are right now. Okay, so a little bit of an assignment for you to do tomorrow, as I promised. But other than that, I think I may end it here today, unless there are any complaints. Nope. Okie dokie. So you can pack it up. I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll, since Russia is kind of done, we'll try to tie up some loose ends on China as well, okay? All right, that is it.